Timothy McVeigh's court-appointed defense attorney has written this book about the Oklahoma bombing trial. In Others Unknown, the Oklahoma City bombing case and conspiracy, Stephen Jones reconstructs the trial and suggests the 1995 bombing was not the work of just two men. He spoke in Perry, Oklahoma, the town where Timothy McVeigh was apprehended on the day of the bombing. Mr. Jones was invited to speak in Perry by a local newspaper publisher. Subsequently, some residents tried to stop the appearance by appealing to the newspaper and the city council. Their attempts were unsuccessful, and you'll see Mr. Jones talk and the questions by area residents next.
We're going to get started here. I thank everybody for coming out today. On behalf of the Noble County Line and Mr. Jones, we appreciate those of you who have braved the wet and cold weather today. I don't need to give him much introduction because I think everybody here knows who he is. Mr. Jones has been an attorney in Enid for over 30 years and was the lead attorney for Timothy McVeigh and the trial of the Murrah Building bombing. Mr. Jones is going to start out with a short video presentation. Then he will be here to speak, answer questions, whatever, and then we will pull the table out, and anyone who would like to buy a book and have a book signed, we will be happy to do that. So I'm going to turn that right over to you, Stephen Jones.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out today, and if we can turn the lights off for just a moment, I have a short video of about 7 minutes, which was put out by the, or put together, I should say, by either Channel 2 or the CBS affiliate in Denver. And you'll recognize some scenes from Perry in this, and it'll kind of bring back perhaps the highlights of this remarkable trial that we held in this country. And where is Trudy? Did Trudy leave? There she is. Trudy, can you punch the play button? I'm not sure I know where it is, but I'll see it. This is only about 6.5 or 7 minutes. Turned out the lights too soon. Here we go.
Turn on the radio, read the newspapers, and now even surf the net for news. If you want information, you can get it. Since the O.J. Simpson case, trials have become a worldwide fascination. We watched O.J. in court and thought we were learning about the legal system. That was until Timothy McVeigh's trial came along. We soon learned that the rules would be very different. This man, Federal Judge Richard Mage, would make sure of it. There would be organization. Per his instructions, the setup for the media begins.
We have a situation here where we need to establish the tools, the facilities to make it work for the press, and we're doing this on federal property. It's a mammoth undertaking that has been really worked well.
Under the guidelines of the Media Consortium, station engineers string cable. Risers set up in front of the courthouse are numbered and labeled for each organization in an area called the bullpen. The judge even picks the colors and the distance from the fence. It's designed to confine the media to one spot. And there are credentials, one to access the bullpen and the press room, and the rare and treasured courtroom pass. If you don't have these, you don't get in. Check out the line to get your credentials the week before the trial begins. The last-minute media pay for procrastinating.
How long have you been waiting?
We're up to 2.5 hours.
I had a flight this morning that, now I'm just going to have to cancel. We were told we had to go to the bullpen, so I'm a little confused.
One of the biggest challenges covering the trial is the gag order. Judge Mage rules that attorneys can't talk to us.
I think Judge Mage has decided that because he's not sequestering the jurors, because he's going to allow them to go home every night, that the risk that they're going to hear something from one of the lawyers after the court each day or before court each day is simply too great. And so what he's done is he's told the lawyers they can't talk about this case until it's over.
And so the amoeba is born, a kind of walking press conference, an all-out battle to get even the slightest comment from Stephen Jones. When we weren't chasing Jones, we often relied on evidence from the courtroom.
Every Halloween when we took the kids trick and treat,
the judge made tapes like this available to the media at the end of each day. Bill McVeigh, Tim McVeigh's father, narrated this video shown during the sentencing phase of the trial. And we used courtroom artwork. Sketch artists like Walt Stewart were in high demand. The good seats in the courtroom are rare because a barrier keeps most of us from even seeing the jurors, the judge's idea to protect their privacy. And there are only a few seats where you can see McVeigh. Another challenge? On cold days, and there are a lot of them, keeping gear dry is a pain. Chairs become shovels, and in between attorney walk shots, photographers, well, become bored. At least the snowman has his credentials. As the trial comes to a close, waiting for the verdict and the sentence are nerve-wracking to say the least. The clock ticks on, the calendars await another mark, reporters type their guilty and not guilty stories, not knowing what's ahead.
Just knowing that at any minute it's going to hit and this road is going to just absolutely turn around and change.
When McVeigh's sentence is announced, crowds gather around a television crew getting word from a two-way radio, relaying the information directly to Tom Brokaw.
The jury recommends, by unanimous vote, that the following sentence be imposed. The defendant, Timothy McVey, will be sentenced to death.
And so 3 months after it begins, one of the biggest trials in U.S. history goes down as a model for the legal system, described by observers as justice at its best.
This is the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather reporting tonight from Denver.
Good evening. The jury that convicted Tim McVeigh of the deadliest act of terror on U.S. soil has decided his punishment. Acting as what the judge called the conscience of the nation, the jury recommended that McVeigh be put to death for bombing the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 of his fellow Americans. It was the decision many in Oklahoma were waiting for and, frankly, hoping for. The Oklahoma governor called it, and I quote, right and proper. Our coverage begins here in Denver with CBS News correspondent Scott Pelley at the U.S. Courthouse. Scott.
Dan, Tim McVeigh was escorted out of the courtroom by 4 federal marshals. As he rose after the verdict, he turned and looked at his parents and mouthed the words, "It's all right." The sense here at the courthouse among the lawyers, the victims of the bomb, and the families is one of exhaustion. Just moments ago, the lawyers spoke about the verdict.
This is not a day of great joy for the prosecution team. We're pleased that the system worked and that justice prevailed. But the verdict doesn't diminish the great sadness that occurred in Oklahoma City 2 years ago. Our only hope is that the verdict will go some way to preventing such a terrible, drastic crime from ever occurring again. Thank you.
The jury has spoken, and their verdict is entitled to respect, and all Americans should accord it that respect until such time, if ever, it is overturned by a court of competent jurisdiction. We ask that the barriers and intolerance which have divided us may crumble, that suspicions disappear, and that hatreds cease, and that our divisions and intolerance being healed, we may live together in justice and peace. God save the United States of America. God save this honorable court. Since we're a smaller group here and somewhat informally, I'll just sit here on the edge of the table if that's all right. First of all, I want to thank Mr. and Mrs. Smith and the Noble County Line for inviting me here to speak to you today and to answer your questions concerning the Oklahoma City bombing. I almost think I'm speaking to more media than I am prospective book purchasers, but I'm somewhat used to that by now. I do want to say, however, a couple of things about Perry. It's a privilege for me to be here today. I've practiced in the courts in this county for more than 3 decades. And one of the greatest men, one of the greatest lawyers, and certainly one of the greatest United States attorneys, Paul Kress, came from this community. I did not know him when he was a United States attorney, but I knew him when he was a judge. Henry Bellman, who was governor of this state and from this county, was responsible for bringing me to Oklahoma and for making it possible for me to go to the University of Oklahoma Law School and to work to his office, typed up a petition for writ of habeas corpus to see the prisoner, came over, and your local associate district judge, who also acted in accordance with the law, held up the surrender of Mr. McVeigh and taking him into physical custody by the federal government until Royce Hobbs could talk to him. Now, I have made reference to that very professional and certainly most appropriate action by Royce Hobbs, and I think that that type of conduct by a lawyer operating in a very difficult situation is what we expect lawyers to do. That's what I was trained to do when I was in law school. That's what Royce Hobbs was trained to do. And he came over here without knowing anything about the case. He just knew that there was a prisoner in the jail trying to reach him that couldn't, and he couldn't see him, and he insisted on seeing him. And so I'm happy to take this opportunity. It's one of the reasons I came to Perry today, quite frankly, was to tell you what a remarkably professional job he did that day. With respect to the Oklahoma City bombing and my own role in the case, and I'll take just a few moments to talk about that and a couple of things about the case, and I'll be glad to try to answer your questions to the extent that I can. On the night of May the 5th, which coincidentally happened to be the 26th anniversary to the day of my permanent arrival in Enid, I had, as I described in the book, returned to my office late after taking a woman who was a friend of ours to the airport in Dallas to fly home to Bucharest, Romania. And on the way down, I had taken her by the Murrah building and shown her the site, put her on the plane, and then came back. When I got to my office about maybe 6 o'clock or 6:15, there was a little notice taped to the back of my chair, and it said, "Mr. Jones, Chief Judge Russell desires you call him." And there were his phone numbers. I tried to reach the judge. There was no answer at his office, and I called his home and got a recording. I left my name and number and didn't think anything more about it, went on to my house. About 9:30 that night, and I remember quite clearly that it was a stormy night with rain and hail and high winds and lightning and all of those things we associate with May in Oklahoma. The phone rang. I was coming from the upstairs down to the first floor. The lights were off. I knew my own house. I'd lived there 20 years. I didn't need to have the lights on in order to find my way around. I went into the library and picked up the phone. And when I picked it up, I was aware that it wasn't the typical sound that you hear when you pick up a phone. It was as though there was some sort of tunnel almost. And I heard a voice on the line call my name, and I identified myself, and the voice said, "Mr. Jones, this is the Department of Justice Watch Command Center in Washington, D.C. Please stay on the line for Chief Judge Russell from Oklahoma City." In a few moments, I heard the judge's voice, and the voice from Washington said, "Your Honor, Mr. Jones is on the line. This is a secure telephone." Judge Russell greeted me, and we said a few words there, and then he said, "Stephen, I'll come straight to the point. I have a question to ask you, and I've consulted with the other judges down here, and here's my question. I want to know whether you will agree to represent an individual who has been or will be charged in the Oklahoma City bombing case." Now, the way he said it indicated to me that there would be others charged, because at that time only Tim McVeigh had been charged. And the judge was very careful, and I presumed at the time that was the reason perhaps for the secure telephone communications, because he said someone who has been charged or will be charged in the Oklahoma City bombing. I thought for a moment, and I said, well, I don't have a professional problem with it. I understand what you're trying to do. And I've certainly been involved in controversial cases before. But I've never been involved in a case in which I thought my wife or my home or children or family or business associates or even the building where I practice law would be at risk. And I think in fairness I should first discuss it with them. He said, certainly, and I said, may I call you back tomorrow about 6:30? And he said, yes. So we talked about another 15 or 20 minutes, and then he and I disengaged our conversation. I had not expected the judge's call. I had not campaigned or solicited or sought or finagled or even indicated any interest or that I might be available to represent Tim McVeigh. It was the furthest thing from my mind. My wife, however, thought that I might be called. And I had that in mind as I thought about the judge's conversation. And as I looked out the window that night, I remembered that when I was 6 or 7 years old, I had felt the ground move beneath my feet in Houston, Texas, because the SS Grand Camp had exploded in the harbor at Texas City, some 50-odd miles away, loaded with hundreds of tons of ammonia nitrate. The explosion was so great that it killed over 500 people, including all 23 members of the Texas City Fire Department. And I could feel it 60-some-odd miles away and hear it. I remembered that when I was 19 years old, I spent the summer working for a funeral home in Houston, Texas. And the week before I left for college, we had been out one day about 10 o'clock in the morning when the radio on the ambulance crackled and there was a police call stating that there had been some type of explosion at the Edgar Allan Poe Elementary School and directing us, because that was in our zone, to respond. Well, I had gone to Poe. I had spent 4 of my 6 years as an elementary student at Poe, and I knew precisely where it was. And so I told Martin Kelly, who was driving, you go down 2 blocks and over a block and so forth. And we were there in maybe 2 minutes. When we drove up, there was an eerie quietness to it. There was no other emergency vehicle. Nobody came out to greet us. It was almost surreal. And I got out of the ambulance and frankly wondered why we had been called, when all of a sudden Martin Kelly hollered my name and said, look, and he pointed, and I followed where he pointed, and at the end of the building, a small boy, maybe 8, 9, or 10 years old, covered in blood, with his right arm blown off, came staggering around the corner. For on that day, a man from Seminole, Oklahoma, had come onto the ground of Edgar Allan Poe Elementary School and set off a bomb, which killed a number of people. As a result of that experience, that Christmas, and for 19 Christmases thereafter, I spent it the same way. I went to the midnight service at Christ Church Episcopal Cathedral in Houston, and every Christmas Eve it was exactly the same. I could hear the rustle and hustle and bustle in the back and smell the poinsettias and the Christmas trees. And precisely at 10:30, the great choir began its procession up the center aisle to the sanctuary, singing, "O Come, All Ye Faithful." There were probably 100 of them, and they would be followed by canons and sub-canons and acolytes and deacons and subdeacons, and then the symbol of episcopal authority, a shepherd's staff, and then behind it, wearing the robes of a bishop, J. Milton Richardson, the Bishop of Texas, with the mitre on the crown of his head. And each Christmas Eve that I heard him, he preached the same sermon. I knew it by heart. I heard it so often. It lasted precisely 10.5 minutes, and it was, what does Christmas Eve mean to a dying child? So these were the thoughts that were on my mind as I thought about what I had seen and heard and read about Oklahoma City and the judge's call. About 45 minutes later, my wife came in, and since she didn't know anything that had transpired, she, of course, first asked why all the lights were out, and I told her to come in. I said, "Jonesy, come in a moment, I have something to tell you." So when she came in, I said, "Booter," one of my nicknames for her, "the call that you were afraid would come has come." And she said, "Oh my God, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, what we are going to do is to sit down and discuss it as husband and wife, call the children, and think about it." So we did. most of the night. The next day, I talked with a number of clients and friends whose judgment I respected, and I concluded my deliberations and conversations with a call to Governor Keating, who was then a client of mine, and then I called the judge at 6:30. I repeated the question back to him, and I said, Your Honor, in response to the question you asked, whether I would agree, if asked, to represent an individual who has been or will be charged in the Oklahoma City bombing, the answer is yes. The judge said, great. In fact, I almost thought that he sounded as though a great burden had been lifted off of his shoulders. He said, be in my chambers at 1:30 Monday afternoon, ready to go to work. So, 1:30 Monday afternoon, I drove down, parked my car. No word had leaked, one of the few things in the Oklahoma City bombing case that didn't leak. And the Murrah building was ringed by fences, and the FBI were going through evidence. They were still recovering bodies. The perimeter was patrolled by the National Guard and the Oklahoma City Police Department. I walked into the building. No one took any particular notice of me. I went up to the third floor where Judge Russell's chambers were and walked in, and there was a small ceremony, and he gave me my commission. And then he asked everyone to leave the room except me. So after they were all out and he shut the door, he came over to where I was sitting. I stood up, and he sort of smiled and held out his hand and said, well, Stephen, I hope I haven't signed your death warrant. I said, well, David, the only time since he's been judge I ever used his Christian name, I said, that makes two of us. And he smiled and he said, well, the marshals will take you to meet your new client. So I rode with the marshals 30 miles west to El Reno to the federal prison. Media, some of you that I recognize today, were standing across the street. And you didn't know why I was there, probably didn't know it was me, and I pulled in with them and met the warden, and after going through some rather elaborate security, went down a long hall to a small room and opened the door, following the marshal and warden. There was a young man in khakis, crew cut. He stood up, and I went over to him. I stuck out my hand, and I said, Mr. McVeigh, my name is Stephen Jones. I've been appointed by the federal court to represent you. And he said, well, I heard you were coming. So at that point, the warden and the marshals excused themselves, and I'm sure they heard my first words to Mr. McVeigh as they closed the door, which were, why don't you sit down for a few minutes and tell me something about yourself? So I began an odyssey of 2.5 years to represent what was called the most hated man in America. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but clearly he was the most hated man in Oklahoma. The question was asked of me at the time, and continues to be asked, of why I did it. How difficult was it for me, and what was it like? Well, the reason that I did it is simple enough. The court asked me to. As I told you before, I didn't seek the appointment, although I understood a lot of people did. Later, the judge showed me all the letters that he had. It looked like everybody had but me. Maybe it was kind of the reverse, but I'm being facetious, but a lot of people did. The Constitution of the United States, the Sixth Amendment, guarantees an accused the effective assistance of counsel. Now, people that quarrel with that, and the money that was spent, or the fact that Tim McVeigh or somebody said to me, well, I don't doubt Tim McVeigh is entitled to a lawyer, I just don't think he's entitled to Stephen Jones, which I took as a kind of a backhanded compliment. Really, the quarrel isn't with me, because the Crimes and Offenses Act of 1790, I'm going to say that again, the Crimes and Offenses Act of 1790 was the 13th or 14th piece of legislation passed by the first Congress, which met in New York when George Washington was president. So it wasn't something that the ACLU, or as one lady said, the UCLA, or Earl Warren, or a bunch of do-good liberals passed. That's not what happened. It was one of the first acts of Congress, and it says, any accused facing a capital charge in federal court is entitled to a lawyer, quote, learned in the law, close quote, to make his, quote, full defense, close quote. That's it. And every piece of legislation since then, including the Criminal Justice Act of 1994, I believe it is built on the Crimes and Offenses Act signed into law by George Washington. When a federal judge asks a lawyer to defend an incident, unless you have a conflict of interest, and I had none, that is your duty. And as I told Judge Russell, once I had that duty, I couldn't do it with one arm behind my back. Or, as I told him, I'll kick the government's ass every day I can. He said, wouldn't expect anything less. That was my job. It was not my job to judge his guilt or his innocence. That was for the jury. The government put on its evidence. I put on the evidence that I could. The court instructed the jury on the law, and then the jury would determine whether he was guilty or innocent. But clearly, I don't think anyone can seriously maintain that Timothy McVeigh did not get the full benefit of effective assistance of counsel. And I do not expect, if his verdict is ever set aside, and I don't know that it will be set aside, it will not be set aside for that reason. But let us be honest here. This bomb did not kill just 168 people. It killed grandfathers and grandmothers and grandchildren, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters, mothers, daughters, fathers, sons, neighbors, lovers, co-workers, strangers. 6 married couples perished together. 2 sets of infant brothers, 1 mother and son, and 3 women heavy with child. The bomb killed the soon-to-be wed and the newlywed. More than 24 children lost both parents. More than 200 lost one. And in addition to those, it left 500 injured. Some blind, some deaf, some who lost an arm or leg or another part of their face, an ear, or a nose. Thousands of businesses were destroyed. The skyline of Oklahoma City was permanently altered. I was asked to defend a man, a stranger among us, who was charged with an act that had destroyed the lives of tens of thousands of Oklahomans. And to do it in this community, and to do it without any consideration personal to myself, to say for him, to do for him that which he could not say or do for himself. Now, I leave it to others to judge whether I did that successfully or not, or professionally or not. For I knew that there was no way that I could do this and satisfy most people. The controversy concerning my coming here is but a prime example of that. So I ultimately decided that the only person that I really had to satisfy was myself. And that if I felt that I had done everything that I could, that I had acted in a professional way, then I had discharged my duty faithfully under the charge given to me by Chief Judge Russell. The rest I'll let history explain. Now, enough of me. Let me just answer 2 questions and then I'll open it for questions. The first question that I think people should ask themselves is, why Oklahoma City? Well, I'm not telling you any privileged information, so don't think that. But I will tell you that that is one of the 2 areas that I agree with the government on. And I think that the answer is self-evident. The terrorists, whoever they may be, and we may argue about that, but whoever they are, chose Oklahoma City because of what this part of the country represents. This is the heartland. I assure you that when foreigners think of the United States, they do not think of the canyons of New York or the Capitol Dome. They think of the amber waves of grain and the purple mountain majesties. They think of the heartland of this country. And it is this heartland that has the traditional American virtues that made this country what it is: thrift, family, religion, restraint, hard work, discipline. So, because terrorists kill the innocent, they knew that a bomb in Oklahoma City would have far more devastating impact than one in Miami or New York or Los Angeles or any of the other great cities of this country. Here, it would in fact be terror in the heartland. It would be the shot heard around the world. And was it not? Did they not meet their expectations? The second thing is why. And here again I agree with the government, though I have a slightly different interpretation. And again, I'm not basing this on any privileged information. The tragic events of Oklahoma City are the direct result of the tragic events at Mount Carmel, Texas. Now, this is a somewhat controversial subject, and I don't ask you to agree with me. I only tell you my opinion. We live in a country in which federal law enforcement officers cannot shoot and kill 13-year-old boys in the back as they run towards their home. They cannot kill a mother holding an 8-month-old baby in her own house. Nor can you burn down a church or residence on nationwide television and then sort of cover it up, use the means of justice to defeat the ends of justice, and not expect vigilante action. That is not to condone it. It is not to mitigate it. It is not to extenuate it. It is not to justify what happened in Oklahoma City. It is to explain it. And while the truth is still coming out about what happened at Mount Carmel, there are two things that are indisputably not contested. The first is that the initial raid at Mount Carmel, undertaken by the ATF and incidentally codenamed Sideshow, I think, or something like that. No, Showtime. That was the official code word for the ATF raid, Showtime. Certainly appropriately named. The head of the ATF was the Secretary of the Treasury. The Secretary of the Treasury in 1993 was Lloyd Benson, native born to Texas, former United States Senator, senior senator from Texas, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and nominee of the Democratic Party for vice president. He did not know that his law enforcement agency, the ATF, was planning the largest raid in its history in his state. He didn't know that. And the second thing that is not contested, for she admitted herself, is the Attorney General of the United States, who had no experience in federal law enforcement, after giving the decision to use gas, CS gas, to insert into this building, which we cannot use against our enemies in war because of the Geneva Convention, but which she authorized against American citizens in a time of peace, got up and left the command post to go to Baltimore, Maryland to make a speech. When the President of the United States was offered her resignation, he should have accepted it. For in no other Western democracy would a minister of justice survive such a debacle. But, frankly, the media, the political process, and the great majority of American people thought all those people were kooks, and clearly some of them were. But they weren't all kooks. One of them was a Harvard Law School graduate. Another one was a registered civil engineer. They were members of an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they had lived in that facility on that ground, or not necessarily that facility, but on that ground for 60 years, more or less peacefully as anybody else in McLennan County, Texas. So we paid the price in Oklahoma for that debacle. The people that died there 2 years apart, almost at the same hour, the same day, along the same interstate highway, suffered and endured the passion of death. And they received in return the gifts of grace and salvation. They are dead, and we are left alive. But of course, in a larger sense, they are not dead. For it is true that the spirit of the dead always survive in the memory of the living. So I have written this book because I do not believe that the American people were told the full story. A criminal trial is never a place to learn the full story about anything. I don't know everything, but when I chose the preface for the book, I couldn't quite decide between the words of the gospel, I believe it's St. Matthew's, which are over the main entrance to the administration building of the University of Texas, where I was privileged to be an undergraduate, and the same words are over the entrance to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The words, and I'm sure most, if not all of you, will remember them: "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make ye free." But I thought, since this was my story, that perhaps would be presumptuous because it would suggest that I knew the truth. So I took instead those famous words from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which described my own experience. "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part." Well, I do know in part, but I still see through a glass darkly. I very much appreciate your invitation today. I appreciate your controversy, which has brought all these friends of mine from the media out. And here we are. I'll try to answer any questions, and if anyone has to leave, I'll be glad to sign your book. Don't all speak at once.
I've got a quick question for
Sure.
you. In your book, you mentioned that I believe friends of yours named Farrell
Yes.
lost a daughter in the explosion, close friends of yours. How did that make you and your wife feel personally as you undertook a case?
Well, the most difficult moment I had in 2.5 years was during the second stage of the trial, the punishment stage. The government produced a number of survivors and members of the family of the deceased, one of whom was Susan Farrell's sister, who is an attorney, as Susan was an attorney. And among the exhibits that the government intended to offer through Miss Farrell was the eulogy that her father, Don, had delivered at her funeral. I had known Don, or have known Don and Sally Farrell ever since 1963. He's a newspaper publisher, former state senator, close associate of Governor Bellman, and at one time Adjutant General of the state of Oklahoma. When I was the Republican nominee for the United States Senate, Sally and my wife Cheryl, who is in the back, had gone around the square in Chandler, and Sally had introduced Cheryl to her friends and asked them to vote for her friend's husband for the Senate. I did not know the Farrells well, but they were good friends. We were not intimate friends or close friends, but they were certainly good friends. Susan, or Farrell's ashes were, our body was cremated, and the ashes were placed in the coffin of a child which her father held at the funeral when he delivered the eulogy. And he made reference to the fact that these were the same hands that he had used to bring his daughter home from the hospital when she was born. It's a very moving tribute, and one that I certainly understood because I had carried my daughter home from the hospital when she was born. So I knew what grief and agony these words that Don had written meant. But I was also Tim McVeigh's lawyer, and I had said many times that the trial was not a memorial service. So in the courtroom, in the face of the world, so to speak, because there was certainly a lot of media there, and with Miss Farrell on the witness stand, and the government, Pat Ryan, with the exhibit in hand, moved to offer it, I stood up, addressed the court, and said, I object. It is prejudicial. Judge Mate said, sustained, and I sat down. That was the most difficult moment for me. Had I not objected, it would have gone in and I would not have discharged my duty. Would it have made a difference? Probably not. But it was still my duty on that occasion not to be Don Farrell's friend, but to be Tim McVeigh's lawyer. So that was the most difficult moment. Ken?
Stephen, how surprised, if at all, were you by the protest that surfaced last week relative to your appearance here? And what is this common when you speak and attend book signings?
Well, I just hope none of you find out that I orchestrated it myself. But no, I'm being facetious. I was not surprised. I understand that it is a matter of sensitivity for some people. I mean, clearly there's a First Amendment, but that doesn't mean that we all have to like what somebody else says or agree with it. I thought the City Council made the right decision, the only one permitted by law. But no, it is not a common occurrence. I have spoken at book signings where members of victims' families have come up. Victims and survivors themselves have written me and asked me to autograph the book, or they've called me or come by or talked on the phone. They greeted me in Denver. I remember in particular one day coming out of the hotel where several victims and police officers who had recovered survivors came over and spoke to me in warm and affectionate terms. And I've spoken in Denver at book signings where members of the jury came up and wanted to meet me and exchange a few words, and even bought a book and asked me to autograph it, which I was happy to do. So I would not say that it's a typical occurrence. Yes, ma'am.
It's nice to see you, and thank you for coming here. First, did you ever investigate what Timothy McVeigh said at the very first about the Army placing a chip in his buttocks?
Well, yes, I did. And while I can't really go into what Tim McVeigh told me, except to the extent that it doesn't impact on the attorney-client relationship, one of the criticisms that I had of the media were that a number of stories which clearly, or incidents which clearly were humorous at the time they occurred, were taken out of context as some sort of demonstration of my client's character or personality. And other stories were outright false. For example, and then I'll come back to the chip in the buttocks. The Washington Post on the Saturday morning after Mr. McVeigh was taken into custody here, his headline was, McVeigh says he is political prisoner, gives only name, rank, and serial number. That's totally untrue. That wasn't what happened at all. I have a copy of the FBI memorandum of interview with Mr. McVeigh conducted in the jail here, which is the only time he was ever interviewed or talked with them, and he never made those statements. He didn't give name, rank, and serial number, and he did not refer to himself as a political prisoner. But an image was being created at that time. The political spin on it was that the real perpetrators here, while they may have arrested McVeigh, the real perpetrators were Rush Limbaugh, Gordon Liddy, and all the people on talk radio, or the militia. In fact, Morris Dees even wrote a book criticizing the militia and had a whole chapter about Tim McVeigh. And I told him, I said, well, Morris, he asked me what I thought about it. We appeared on a program together. I said, Morris, you got a great book here. The only problem is Tim McVeigh was never a member of the militia. So, I mean, I don't know why you got a chapter on McVeigh in a book about the militia. Another example was one the Fort Worth Star-Telegram sponsored, which again got repeated throughout the world, was that the FBI had found a diary belonging to McVeigh that had a list of buildings and other cities he was going to bomb. There was no diary. There was no list. There was also the story about the Bolero, you know, the cross X with all the bullets, kind of like Mark of Zorro. Well, it was true that Tim McVeigh had worn that. It was also true that it was at a Halloween costume party. The chip in the buttocks statement was one that he facetiously made to somebody one day who repeated it facetiously, and then it got picked up as the gospel truth. Let me assure you, and I think I can say this, Tim McVeigh never believed that there was a chip in his buttocks. He is a very intelligent person with a high IQ, well-read, and one may think a lot of things about Tim McVeigh, but he's not a paranoid schizophrenic personality.
I talked to lawyer Mr. Box, Irwin Box, and I sent you some papers and a book by Tex Mars, and he had a whole. Did you receive it?
Yes, I did.
Well, all righty.
Yes,
what do you think of it? I was thinking it's kind of like Frank Sinatra's movie, The Manchurian Candidate, you know, and I was wondering what you thought about that chapter.
Well, I remember the book, and I remember Mr. Mars, as I recall, also puts out a bulletin or a newsletter or something, which goes to a rather large mailing list, and I believe you also sent me that. I do remember that, but I have to be frank with you and tell you that after the trial is over, most of that leaves my mind. I don't remember details, and even now when friends of mine will ask me about such and such, I'll say, well, you know, I think that sounds right, but I'm just not sure. Lawyers can't possibly hold it. I don't relive the case. It's over, and I move on, and I certainly remember some things, and there's some things that I keep for reference, but I don't specifically remember it, I'm afraid to say.
That's fine. Senator Keyes, I talked with him. I knew he was a good guy because all the papers were calling him names, but he's a very nice gentleman, and he was, anyway, it was victims and families of victims in the Murrah bombing that had asked him to investigate it. And I was wondering, do you think that the bombing site should have been left as it was until the grand jury investigation was through?
No. I have a somewhat different view of that. The building was in a very weakened condition, structurally. There was a very real possibility that on the night of the bombing, that is the Wednesday, the night of April 19th, that when they were anticipating high winds, that the building would have collapsed that night. But as some of the reporters will remember, the winds actually shifted to the south and west and resulted in the airport being closed and didn't directly go over the bomb site. So clearly they had to tear the building down or implode it at one time because it was a public health hazard. I wanted to get into the building and inspect it before it was imploded. The government resisted that. I went to the judge. The judge said he would sign an order allowing us in. But my own experts had already told me that they were confident the building had been sanitized. And I remember in particular one of the bombing experts told me that, he said, I'm going to bet you a steak dinner, Stephen, that when you get down there, the bombing crater will be covered and you will not be permitted to inspect it. And sure enough, when we got down there, the bombing crater was covered and they wouldn't roll it back for us. And he said, well, that's the most important thing we're going to see. The rest of it has been sanitized and really is of no evidentiary value. And frankly, he was right. It wasn't of any evidentiary value. And we never did get to examine the crater, which at that time would have been very important to us.
I had a question raised to me earlier the people who identified him from Junction City, there's a military base nearby. So was it unusual for them to see slender men with crew cuts, army-type men to come into that town or that place?
Well, no, it's not unusual, and here's the circumstance of that. And I want to be fair to all participants, but at the same time, I want to tell you my own interpretation of the evidence. To say that somebody in Junction City was tall, thin, and had a crew-cut blonde hair only described about 4,500 men at Fort Riley, which is like, well, the back door of Fort Riley is next to Junction City. That's no description at all. The description of John Doe 2, short, squat, stocky, tattoo, black hair, would also describe a fair number of people at Fort Riley. Now, this is the place where I have the greatest disagreement with the government. I believe that, well, I perhaps should tell you why I believe that. When the government finally started giving us the witness statements, they didn't give them to us alphabetically, and they didn't give them to us chronologically. They just dumped them. Here's 7,000, here's 5,000, so on. So the judge made them give us an index, and they gave us 2 indexes. The first was an index alphabetically, so if the government had interviewed Sally Smith, well, we could look and see when that occurred. The other index was the far more interesting one because it was an index by serial number, which meant that it was fairly easy to tell how the FBI's investigation had progressed because we now knew the order in which they interviewed witnesses because they had given us that. Well, after we learned a lot about the case, I went back and reviewed that document and formed the opinion that the real investigation of who bombed the Alfred P. Murrah building lasted about 6 weeks. After that 6 weeks, the level of investigation of the bombing dropped to maybe 10% of the effort. And the other 90% was building the case against Tim McVeigh. And that case was held and built because they knew that at some point we were going to get all those witness statements, and when we got the witness statements, we would understand that there were some problems with the case. When they gave us the witness statements, they then changed directions once again and did counter-exculpatory. That is to say, they tried to impeach that which they had given us. But the real, so to speak, independent, neutral, objective investigation of who are the murderers, who set the bomb off, lasted about 6 weeks, most of the time. Now, there was always some minimal effort going on. Well, that brings up the issue of John Doe 2, which is one of the most misunderstood issues of the case. Clearly, there is a John Doe 2. I mean, there's no question about that. And here's how you know. Contrary to what the Oklahoma County Grand Jury said, that John Doe 2, if you interviewed everybody, ranged from 5'4" to 6'3", from thin to weighing 300 pounds, et cetera, et cetera. You remember when Judge Burkett read that into the record. That's not being quite intellectually honest. As I said myself many times, I know who John Doe 2 is. He's every divorced woman in Kansas' ex-brother-in-law. And that's what most of or many of those witness statements were. The real key is this. The 3 people at Elliott's, Eldon Elliott, Vicki Beamer, and Tom Kissinger, were all present when the Ryder truck was rented. Transaction that took about 10 minutes. Now, we're not talking about the Hertz rent-a-car counter at JFK, much less Oklahoma City World Airport. We're talking about a little business that maybe rents 1 Ryder truck a day. And because its real business is body shop. And so when somebody pulls in to rent a Ryder truck, that's a kind of a social hour. I mean, people take their coffee break then and kind of wander in to see who's renting the truck. Where are you moving to, buddy? Where you been? What's your rank out there at Fort Riley? So when Kling walks in the door, Kissinger comes in to take his coffee break. All three of those people told the FBI there were 2 people present. 2 of them. Vicki Beamer's exact words were to Joe Hartzler in front of the grand jury when he asked, how positive are you there were 2 of them? She said, absolutely 100% certain. Now, it's real difficult to find some breathing room there. Absolutely 100% certain. So the government had to come up with a theory. And the theory was that, oh, no, these people are mistaken. There was a guy in there on Tuesday afternoon named Todd Bunting, and those 3 people at Elliott's are confused, and they have moved Bunting from 4 o'clock Tuesday to 4 o'clock Monday and put him next to Kling, who is McVeigh. Well, aside from the obvious fact that how can you believe anybody about Kling being McVeigh if they're confused about the number of people in the room 48 hours later, the fallacy of that is that Vicki Beamer personally knew the man that Todd Bunting came in with. Michael Hertig, she knew. And so when the FBI kind of tried that theory out on her, she said, well, that's not true. Todd Bunting came in with my friend Michael Hertig. I know. I'm not confusing them. They're 2 different people. The government has gone to great lengths to tell the American people there is no John Doe 2. John Doe 2 is Todd Bunting. Well, if that's true, then why did the government, for 14 months after that, and as far as I know, may still be doing it today because they were certainly doing it during our trial, continue to look for John Doe 2? I mean, Todd Bunting, everybody knew where he was. He was down in Georgia. They have torn the world up. And when I mean torn it up, I mean that they have looked at every driver's license, every medical discharge, every Social Security record, and I know this because I have copies of them, every police report of anybody named Robert Jacks in every spelling, because they believe that John Doe 2's alias is Robert Jacks. And why do they believe that? Well, for a variety of reasons, which I won't take up all your time. They are convinced of it. But from a trial strategy standpoint, to say, well, gee, we haven't caught everybody, you can't say that. What you have to say is, we caught them, and here they are. Now, how do you know that? Well, the way you know it is because it's intellectually dishonest. It's just like Michael and Lori Fortier. You remember the Attorney General of the United States said, and the President said, we will seek the death penalty against everybody involved in this conspiracy. Well, that's not true. They didn't. It's intellectually dishonest. Because if the government is correct, and most people think they're correct, Michael and Lori Fortier are members of the conspiracy. They didn't get the death penalty. Lori Fortier sleeps in her own bed at night with her own children. I know lots of mothers and fathers who lost babies in Oklahoma City that don't have that privilege. And I don't want to get any names or name anybody, but I once had a meeting long after the trial was over with the prosecutor, and we were just shooting the breeze. And he said, you know, Stephen, he said, my golly, you sure gave us a run for our money. And but wouldn't you have felt terrible if you'd walked that guy? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you let somebody involved in the bombing go free. I said, well, I only know one person that walked somebody, and that was you. Me? Who'd I walk? I said, well, do you believe Lori Fortier's testimony? Oh, absolutely, I believe it. I said, well, how much more central to the conspiracy can you be than to help prepare the false identification of Robert Kling that you say my client used to rent the truck? How much more central to the conspiracy can you be than to have wrapped up blasting caps in Christmas paper and given them to Tim McVeigh, if what she said is true. Now, I ask you, what was Lori Fortier convicted of? Nothing. Now, I don't question the government's discretion to immunize her to use her testimony. That's purely legitimate. What I question is to then the intellectual honesty of saying to the American people, everyone associated with the conspiracy has received the death penalty, or at least we're going to seek the death penalty. When clearly, if their case is true, that's not true. So that and the statement there's no John Doe 2 convinces me, and that's why I wrote the book, that there is essentially an intellectual dishonesty in the government's presentation that they have arrested everybody accused or everybody involved in the conspiracy. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just two more.
Okay.
First, the truck that was loaded with the chemicals and stuff. I was talking to an older Army person, and he said it was more like a pineapple bomb placed, the way the building fell and stuff. Is it a fact that that one truckload that they brought there did all that damage?
Yes, I believe it did.
Okay.
I don't subscribe to General Parton's theory. My experts could not validate it. General Parton is a very illustrious retired Army officer. I believe he's Army, maybe he's Air Force. But we interviewed him, the government interviewed him. I read his reports. I also sent those reports abroad, along with other evidence that General Parton did not have access to, and they could not validate it. Doesn't mean he's wrong, it just means we couldn't prove he was right. It's like the ATF having advanced knowledge. I think it is possible the ATF had advanced knowledge, but it is not true that ATF agents stayed away from the Murrah building on the morning of April the 19th because of such knowledge, because the director of the local ATF office was in the building on the 9th floor when the bomb went off. I have no evidence that the agents were not there because of some prior warning or that it was a sting operation gone bad. So to that extent, I agree with the government.
What does Timothy McVeigh say himself? Does he say he's innocent?
I can't tell you what Timothy McVeigh says, at least not what he says to me.
It's not the book?
No. They're none of the attorney. No, it's very clear in the book. It says if you're reading this book to find out what Tim McVeigh said to me, if in fact he said anything, and that's the only reason you're reading it, stop now.
Is that because of appeals?
No, it's because of the attorney-client privilege.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, of course.
I may have to leave, so I think you can entertain questions here in a few more minutes.
Yes, and could I trouble you for a glass of water? Mr. Smith? Thank you. I understand there are a couple of people with books, or one person with books, several people with books. If there are, I'll be glad to sign them. I'm sorry, will your name? You live in Perry, Arizona?
Nice to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Andrews. Thank you. Thank you. Hi. How are you?
Thank you.
It's my privilege. No, that's fine.
I understand what you did.
And this is for who?
Melanie. M-E-L-E-N-I-E.
Like the singer.
Pardon me?
Like the singer. Last name?
Inda. I-N-D-A.
Just for you? You live in Perry? Good.
She had no objection to it being on the shelf. You know, that really is.
Thank you very much. Opioid, right. Thank you. Excuse me. And this is for...
Linda Smith.
Okay. Is that you?
And I hope everybody is still in business.
You have
Stephen Jones was appointed by the court to be Timothy McVeigh's defense counsel in the Oklahoma City bombing case in May of 1995. His book, Others Unknown, is published by PublicAffairs, 250 West 57th Street, Suite 1825, New York, New York, 10107. Mr. Jones is currently working on a biography of Chapman Revercomb, a Republican senator from West Virginia in the 1940s and 50s.